Hello there, I'm Hem. I'm part of the developer relations team at Pipedrive, where we make sure that app builders have the best possible experience extending Pipedrive. But what is Pipedrive? Pipedrive is an easy to use, powerful CRM platform that has been in the market for more than a decade. Now, emphasis on the word platform, because we also have an app marketplace powered by APIs and a developer platform. So why do we have it? Pipedrive realized very early that building a new feature for every customer ask doesn't scale really well. And so they decided to develop an ecosystem based on APIs and a developer platform. This brings in app builders who build apps to solve customer problems, and customers tend to stick with us as a result of fulfilling their needs. Now, this creates a very powerful flywheel. And our job as an ecosystem was to accelerate this flywheel the best we could. And as you would have realized, APIs play a huge role in that flywheel, which goes on to influence the apps and integrations that are also built on top of that. We know through research, both internally and externally, that there is a strong correlation between ecosystem/API growth and the product growth. However, there were some challenges and gaps for our ecosystem users that had an impact on that flywheel. One of the challenges we face is that our product has been around for over 10 years. Back in the day, the APIs were developed after the core product was already built. Different teams would contribute their own APIs based on their specific features. On one hand, users rely on these APIs to create apps and integrations that are crucial for their business. But on the other hand, since the APIs weren't initially treated as a unified product, there are still unmet needs for our ecosystem users. The whole experience ends up being scattered across different API resources, resulting in a classical cost versus profit dilemma. So how do we fix that? The developer relations team embarked on a journey along with the product and research teams to tackle it. From raising awareness about the APIs to objectively identifying any gaps and finally extracting practical steps from those observations, we carefully took those steps to improve the API one step at a time. The first half of the talk contains the highlights from our journey, whereas the other half talks about our approach. It was when we looked at the usage numbers holistically, we came to know how big of a product we were having in our pocket. To be honest, Pipedrive APIs were kind of invisible in the early days, and this could be the case in some of those organizations as well. Let's take a quick look at the numbers to see what I mean. Pipedrive has more than 440 apps across various categories in the marketplace. We receive roughly 50 billion API requests per year from the integrations based on the 245 endpoints that we have. While these numbers may sound impressive, let's also put them into perspective. What if one API request is equal to a cricket ball, or let's say a tennis ball? Something that would very nicely fit the palm of our hand. And in short, we will be able to build 5 pyramids that are roughly the size of the Great Pyramid of Giza using those API requests. One of our top API resource, which is Deals, which also happens to be the central component of our product, is a giant pyramid on its own. Here are some of the other entities. Imagine for a moment, 440 apps, 50 billion API requests, 5 pyramids. We were definitely dealing with a massive product that was surprisingly in stealth mode for a while. Not so long ago, a company called Pandium published a very interesting report. They surveyed 400 SaaS companies to understand the integration landscape. Roughly 3/4 of the 100 largest companies offer marketplaces built on top of such APIs. And as we know, integrations don't work in silos. They are also interconnected. Right from the beginning, it was evident that we were dealing with something crucial that demanded greater visibility within the organization. And what better way to achieve that than relying on good old-fashioned data? The journey continues as we try to understand the API in detail. We were truly under the assumption that it was due to a lack of data that the APIs were misunderstood and not fully visible. But surprise, surprise, the data was already there. What we lacked was a shared understanding on the importance of the API. There is a high chance that different teams interpret the APIs in different ways. I mean, there is nothing wrong with that. Each team has a great understanding in its own way, and it's probably the result of cost and revenue motives at play. And adding on to that, not everybody has access to the relevant data that conveys the value of these APIs. A lack of shared understanding could easily put them in opposing viewpoints. For instance, infra and engineering teams are definitely not going to be happy with resource-hungry endpoints are the ones that have security implications. Product or marketing, on the other hand, might be interested in pushing more, adding more value to the end users. Although it sounds very simple, we had to ensure that all relevant stakeholders have access to these data sources to understand the value proposition. In the next leg of the journey as DevRels, we realized that we enjoyed a unique advantage. Guess what? We were already in touch with a large portion of qualitative data sources, forums, developer interaction via events, solution calls, surveys, all of which gave a sense of the difficulties that developers were facing. The only challenge is that it was predominantly technical in nature. So, although it was a great start for us to understand the API through one particular dimension, we were only seeing half the picture. I mean, it is still a great way to reveal the technical gaps, but it only offered limited insights on how it impacts our ecosystem users at the end of the day, how it impacts their business. So that is the thing that we wanted to know. Let's take an example to see what I mean here. Here are the top 1,000 discussions from the Pipedrive developer community for the year 2022. It gave a sense of where we were in terms of the API technically, and also some ways to tactically improve it, but it was not good enough for bigger strategic wins. Looking at qualitative data sources gave an indication of the experience and quality, whereas quantitative data sources grounded them to reality and showed us the scale, but they don't add much value when they are isolated. We needed a way to combine those effectively and paint a bigger picture during analysis. And this is where things get spicy as we take an interesting route. What we did next might sound like random TikTok advice, but that does summarize things really well in this situation. It was a turning point in the journey when we decided to incorporate an additional dimension apart from the technical aspects. This also involved wider collaboration with other teams and people. So, what is the dimension? To be honest, analyzing the API from the business perspective was not even in our consideration. However, we realized that it is strongly representative of the problem space. We realized that incorporating the business aspect can happen in many ways, and it's definitely not tied to one particular framework or approach. For example, it could be understanding the goals of our users and the actions they take to achieve that. It could be understanding their business process, since it varies from one to another. It could be understanding their use journeys across the product to understand their workflow, or it could be as simple as analyzing the key use cases that they aim to solve with the product. In a way, the technical dimension that we saw earlier correlates strongly with the solution space, whereas the business dimension showed us the problem space. And as you might have figured out, both areas have a connection. From our analysis, we went ahead with the approach of understanding the user needs via the core jobs that they performed. Simply put, jobs to be done. Throughout our analysis, we would notice patterns that connected the granular, disparate topics with high-level insight. We noticed from qualitative sources that there were issues around custom fields and that apps tried to use workarounds to solve them. We also know that as a result of heavy workarounds, certain endpoints were used more heavily than expected. It was definitely easier for us to understand that those were problems related to storing structured information. But we could only see and realize that these same issues also affect the business areas of lead scoring, web activity tracking, and automation for our customers when these issues were contextualized properly. Here is another example that shows the connection between low level and the high level. When users struggle with an area, or if there is high friction, it manifests at the low level in the data sources. They may or may not have the required business context at that stage, but they are vivid explanations about the problems that they face with an endpoint or app or product feature. But if we do associate them, we can understand how it impacts the business of our customers. Now, that right there, that was the key idea. And we had a grid that brought out such insights. Now, we knew that there were more than a couple of patterns, but what we lacked at that stage was a linchpin component that brought everything together. So, what is a linchpin? It is something that connects and brings everything together. For the analysis, we had to connect the low level with the high level, the problem space with the solution space, and vice versa. We didn't have to look further than the marketplace apps themselves. The one component that brought everything together was right there. And apps are pretty cool. They exist to solve a particular business problem. They have both qualitative and quantitative data pertaining to themselves, or at least quantitative data at the minimum. For example, you can figure out installation count, adoption metrics, uninstall rates, ratings, and retention, all of which talk about the app's quality and its ability to solve a particular problem really well. They are also composed of several APIs working in harmony and thereby creating an API footprint. Studying that was essential to understanding the gaps. From there on, it was easy for us to craft a framework around that. Let's call it the API impact grid. And here's how it works. We collect data from relevant sources, both quantitative and qualitative. We assess the developer experience and friction levels corresponding to these API resources. It'll be mostly technical at this point, and that's okay. Next would be understanding the key actions or processes that the users carry out with the product. It answers the question of what problems they face and what objectives they want to achieve. Based on the linchpin component, which in our case are the apps themselves, we combine the data sources into one single view. Finally, we synthesize the data, derive actionables, and cut to action. Let's look at each of those steps in detail. Let's start with data gathering. Like we saw earlier, data plays a crucial role. It is the first step in building this full picture. Here's a map of the data sources we gathered for our analysis. It is definitely not a one-person task, and it's exactly where collaboration plays a big role. Teaming up with data analysts and the research teams helped us move faster in this area, especially with quantitative sources. Now, each ecosystem could be different, and thus there might be different ways of integrating with the product, and thus a different linchpin. At the minimum, it is better to have the data corresponding to the linchpin and the APIs. It is also recommended to follow a common taxonomy for categorizing qualitative feedback. With a shared understanding, it is easier to aggregate the friction score and gap data in the upcoming stages. Assessing the developer experience and friction can vary from one product to the other. Quantitatively speaking, data related to performance and monitoring, response codes, authentication, and documentation will already signal the quality of such endpoints. Additionally, as DevRels, we are in touch with forums and other areas which indicate the gaps and friction for these endpoints. Aggregating that as one single score will already indicate the state of the APIs technically. Even if we stop the analysis at this stage, there will be good amount of input for developer relations and API teams. But now, We're not going to stop here. Coming back to the business perspective, we saw earlier that we decided to understand the core jobs of our users. All we have to do now is to identify the apps corresponding to each job area like so. This forms the linchpin layer that combines APIs with the high-level insights. These apps exist to solve customer problems in specific areas, and APIs enable them to do that. And that is one reason it becomes very powerful when we bring the linchpin component, the apps, into the picture. Now, it is also the key highlight from the state of the API integration report from Cloud Elements. APIs that fit the business needs are the first and foremost expectations from API publishers. This goes on to say how important it is for us to understand the problem space and thus the business aspects of the API. All right, let's put it together like a sandwich and see how it looks like at the end of the day. We collect the relevant data pertaining to the API resources. This is the foundation layer. Although this layer can show the technical gaps, we need a way to combine them. So we introduce the linchpin layer, basically apps, and apps always exist to solve specific business problems. The topmost layer creates an association between the low level and the high level, showing the gaps overall. We call this the API grid, the API impact grid, which is then used for further analysis. In a nutshell, the API impact grid lets us associate, assess, and based on the insights, jump to action. I know that this is quite a lot of information in a short period of time, but don't worry, there is a template that you can copy and apply for your business, and the link is also provided. We are very curious to know how it applies to your product and learn from that. Now, the purpose of the analysis is to identify the gaps and enhance the APIs overall, right? It's definitely not just theory, it's all about application. So this application in turn accelerates the ecosystem flywheel and improves things for everybody. And so we took incremental steps in the areas of both developer relations and product. I would say that we are just getting started, but the impact potential and the early results that we see are already fascinating. Take, for example, the area of developer relations. By ensuring that we strategically generate content, we make it easier to use existing APIs. This brings more visibility and a self-service based approach when it comes to API adoption. It is also important for us to supply tooling and ensure high developer productivity when it comes to working with APIs. API lifecycle management is essential for minimal disruption. It is something that cannot be overlooked. We were able to influence the mentioned areas based on our improved understanding. This directly benefited the app developers who went on to fill the key gaps and accelerate the flywheel. For instance, we identified that the areas of caller integration, messaging, and lead gen apps require special onboarding. And those areas have interactive code tutorials to help the partners onboard at a faster pace. We noticed high friction on authorization and testing in general. And as you may know, Postman is a popular API testing tool used by developers. Rather than forcing developers into a set of tooling, we went where they spend most of their time to fix their problems, and it worked wonders. Now, nobody's happy with a breaking change, right? Breaking changes affect integrations, which have ripple effects, and that ultimately affects the core jobs of our users. The grid helps us identify such business critical endpoints and work with the respective teams to gracefully roll out these changes. It also has an impact on the product side of things. We're able to make advancements in 3 areas that are important for API productization. API design is one of the key derivatives. It ensures that the APIs are well structured. Similarly, bridging the gap between what can be done by the product versus the API has always been a massive ongoing topic. Another key area that it neatly ties into is performance. Resource intensive or slow endpoints add cost to both app developers and the company. The grid enforces a certain level of monitoring and alerting in place to catch such endpoints much earlier and, if required, provide better alternatives. With the grid, we were able to substantiate the need for new endpoints that effectively fill the gaps for ecosystem users. Now, this could be horizontal capabilities such as search, bulk operations, or improved pagination, or vertical capabilities such as new endpoints for a specific business area like deals, leads, or contacts in the context of CRM. Now, it could be different for your business, and this ultimately, bridges the product to a product API parity gap. It would definitely be a stretch to say that the impact grid is the reason why these initiatives exist. Instead, we look at it as a catalyst that adds jetpack to the existing initiatives, making them move faster than before. Well, sorry, I forgot to click the next button, but you could see that these are some of the derivatives from the product side of things, as I mentioned earlier. One of the key highlights from our series of API improvements would definitely be the Postman collection revamp. The corresponding restructuring ensured 10 times growth in adoption, with a lot more developers making use of the collection to stay on top of the changes. As I mentioned earlier, it is a contribution that comes from several people, and some of the smiling faces can be seen here. The rest are busy improving the API. All right, let's recap and look at the takeaways. In a quick recap, we know that we spent some time bringing visibility to the APIs. We understood that there was some gaps for our ecosystem users. And so we started looking at covering those gaps, addressing them with like one dimension, which is the technical dimension. But then we realized that it's not possible to do that with just one dimension. So incorporate the business aspect. And from there, we formulate the API impact grid. We saw the approach. And through that, we were able to build actionable derivatives, bring more visibility to the APIs. And this resulted in us coming up with improvements that improve the API as a whole. Well, quick key takeaways. It's important to employ data analysis to uncover ecosystem user needs. And this is also important to bring a shared understanding in the process. It's also important to identify the ecosystem's linchpin. In our case, it was the apps, because this is the one that bridges the technical and business side of things. And I hope it's probably the same case for you as well. It's either the apps or the integration, but spend more time trying to figure out that component which brings everything together. Similarly, it's also important to incorporate the business aspect. As we saw before, the business perspective is the one that brings more attention to the problem space. So spending more time understanding that would also be very much important. Finally, it's important to engage with the teams to understand their cost and revenue perspectives. And that is crucial, in also making iterative changes to the APIs. This comes in together like really well at the end of the process. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's definitely a lot of information in such a short span of time. But I promise you there's a slide, which is, I promise you that there's a template which is provided in the talk. You can definitely access it and provide us feedback as well. We are very curious to know how it works for your business. And yeah. Well, thank you for joining me today. I hope this talk has given you valuable insight. Let's continue the conversation and definitely learn from each other's experiences. Thank you very much for being here. See ya.